Montana Territory, 1875. The frontier still had teeth, sharp ones that could tear a man to pieces if he wasn't careful. Broken Valley had seen its share of men who thought themselves invincible, only to be humbled by blizzards, bandits, or their own poor judgment. Beau Edwards knew better. 24 years of frontier life had taught him that survival meant keeping to himself, working hard, and never letting anyone close enough to matter. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty Main Street as Beau rode into Broken Valley. His chestnut gelding plodded wearily beneath him, almost as tired as he was after 3 days of hard riding. Dust coated his trail-worn clothes, and his lean face showed the weathering of a man who lived under the open sky. Despite the trail grime, his clean-shaven jaw and the clear intensity of his blue eyes gave him a youthful handsomeness that stood at odds with the wariness in his gaze. Trust gets a man killed on the frontier, his father had told him before a Blackfoot arrow had found his heart. Beau had been just 16 then, left to bury his pa and make his own way. 8 years later he still lived by those words. The cowboy life suited him, seasonal work, moving on before roots could take hold, never staying long enough for goodbyes to matter. What Beau wanted was simple. Enough money to buy his own spread someday, far from others, where he could live by his own rules. What he told himself he didn't need was the complications that came with people, especially women. The West was no place for romance. Love made men careless, and carelessness was a luxury he couldn't afford. As he dismounted in front of the town's only hotel, he caught sight of a young woman emerging from the general store across the street. She wore a simple blue calico dress that somehow managed to appear elegant despite its practicality. Her chestnut brown hair was pulled back in a neat bun, though a few wayward strands had escaped to frame her face. Even from a distance, something about her made him pause, a grace in her movements, perhaps, or the determined set of her shoulders as she balanced a heavy crate in her arms. "Need a hand with that, miss." The words were out before he could stop them, surprising himself as much as the woman, whose deep green eyes widened as she turned toward his voice. "I can manage, thank you," she replied, though the crate clearly strained her arms. Beau surprised himself again by crossing the street anyway. "I'm sure you can," he said, "but my ma would haunt me from her grave if I watched a lady struggle and did nothing." A flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, crossed her face. "Well, we can't have you haunted." She allowed him to take the crate, which was heavier than it looked. "I'm Willow Emerson," she added, studying him with curious eyes. "Beau Edwards," he replied, suddenly conscious of his trail dust and sweat. "Just rode in. For the cattle drive, Mr. Peterson's been hiring hands." Beau nodded. "That's the plan. Need work before winter sets in." "Then I suppose you'll be staying a while." It wasn't quite a question, and something in her tone made him glance at her more carefully. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 20 or 21, but there was a maturity in her eyes that spoke of hardship weathered. "Just long enough for the drive," he said firmly. "Staying in one place too long invited trouble." "Where would you like this crate?" "The schoolhouse. I'm the teacher here." She gestured down the street. "It's not far." The revelation surprised him. She seemed young to be responsible for the education of Broken Valley's children, but frontier towns couldn't afford to be particular. Teachers were scarce and good ones even scarcer. As they walked, Willow drew curious glances from townspeople. Some nodded respectfully, others watched with undisguised interest as the dusty cowboy followed the schoolteacher down the street. Beau felt uncomfortably conspicuous. "You're causing quite a stir, Miss Emerson," he observed. A small smile played at her lips. "It's not me they're looking at, Mr. Edwards. Broken Valley doesn't see many new faces, especially ones that help schoolteachers carry their supplies." The schoolhouse was a modest building at the edge of town, one room with a small attached living quarters. As Willow opened the door, Beau was struck by how tidy and welcoming the space felt, with rows of neat desks facing a larger teacher's desk and blackboard. "Just there is fine," Willow directed, pointing to a spot near her desk. As Beau set down the crate, the floorboards beneath his feet creaked oddly. He wouldn't have thought twice about it, except that Willow's gaze darted quickly to the spot, and a flash of something like alarm crossed her face before she composed herself. "Thank you for your help," she said, a bit too quickly. "I'm sure you'll want to get settled at the hotel." Beau recognized a dismissal when he heard one. Something about that section of floor had made her nervous, but it wasn't his concern. He nodded, tipping his hat. "Glad to help, Miss Emerson." As he turned to leave, his spurs caught on a raised floorboard, nearly sending him sprawling. His hand shot out to catch himself against her desk, and as he regained his balance, he noticed that his misstep had dislodged the board slightly, revealing a hint of darkness beneath. Willow was at his side instantly. "Are you all right?" "Fine," he replied, eyes still on that sliver of darkness. "Looks like you've got a loose board there." "Old building," she said dismissively, moving to stand between him and the spot. "The whole place needs repairs." Beau knew he should leave it alone, but curiosity, a dangerous trait on the frontier, got the better of him. "Seems like more than just a loose board. Looks like there might be a space under there." Something shifted in Willow's expression: fear, resignation, then determination. "Mr. Edwards, I appreciate your help today, but—" The schoolhouse door burst open, cutting her off. A boy of about 12 rushed in, breathless. "Miss Emerson. Pa sent me to fetch you. There's a man at the hotel asking questions about you." The color drained from Willow's face. Her eyes, wide with alarm, met Beau's for just a moment before she turned to the boy. "Thank you, Tommy. Tell your father I'll be there shortly." After the boy left, she stood motionless, staring at the door as if expecting someone else to burst through it. "Miss Emerson," Beau asked, concerned by her sudden pallor. "Is everything all right?" She seemed to remember his presence with a start. "Yes, of course, just town business." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirt. "I should go." "Thank you again for your assistance." Beau watched her hurry out, unable to shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The loose floorboard, her reaction to the boy's news, they hinted at secrets, and secrets in a small frontier town rarely boded well. He told himself it wasn't his concern as he walked back to the hotel. He'd come to Broken Valley for work, not to get tangled in whatever trouble the schoolteacher might be facing. Getting involved with other people's problems was exactly the kind of complication he'd always avoided. Yet as he arranged for a room and stabled his horse, he found himself watching the street, waiting for Willow's return. When she finally appeared, she was accompanied by the town sheriff, a grizzled man with a pronounced limp, and her face was set in lines of worry that made her look older than her years. Just passing through, Beau reminded himself as he carried his saddlebags to his room, "Don't get involved." But that night, as he lay on the lumpy hotel mattress, he couldn't get the image of that loose floorboard out of his mind, or the fear in Willow Emerson's eyes when the boy mentioned someone asking about her. He'd seen that kind of fear before, in the eyes of people running from something or someone. The next morning, Beau reported to the Peterson ranch as planned. The foreman, a no-nonsense man named Harris, hired him on the spot after learning of his experience with cattle. The drive would begin in 3 days, moving 1,000 head north to the railhead at Helena. "We'll be 2 weeks on the trail, weather permitting," Harris explained. "Pays fare $1.50 a day plus found." It was good work, exactly what Beau had come for. Yet as he rode fence lines that day, checking Peterson's boundaries, his thoughts kept returning to the schoolteacher and her secret floor. When his path took him near town in the late afternoon, he found himself steering his horse toward the schoolhouse almost without conscious decision. Children were just being dismissed when he arrived. They streamed out the door in a chattering wave, some casting curious glances his way before scattering toward their homes. Beau dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post, and waited until the last child had gone before approaching the open door. Willow stood at her desk, organizing papers, her back to the entrance. Sunlight from the western windows caught in her hair, highlighting auburn tones he hadn't noticed before. "Miss Emerson," he called softly from the doorway. She startled, turning quickly. "Mr. Edwards," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "I didn't expect to see you again." "Signed on with Peterson," he explained, stepping into the schoolroom. "We ride out in 3 days." She nodded, watching him with guarded eyes. "I see. Did you need something?" Beau hesitated, suddenly uncertain why he'd come. "I wanted to make sure you were all right. Yesterday, with that news about someone asking after you, you seemed troubled." A complex series of emotions crossed her face: surprise, wariness, and something that might have been appreciation. "It was nothing," she said finally. "Just a misunderstanding." It was a lie, and not a particularly convincing one. Beau took another step into the room, his eyes drawn to the section of floor where he'd stumbled. In the clear light of day, he could see that several boards didn't quite match the others, newer perhaps, or simply cut differently. Willow followed his gaze, her shoulders tensing. "Mr. Edwards, why are you really here?" The directness of the question demanded an equally direct response. There's something under your floor, he said, something you're protecting, and someone's looking for you. Those two facts seem likely to be connected. She stood very still, studying him with those remarkable green eyes. And if they are, what business would that be of yours? It was a fair question. He had no answer that made sense, even to himself. None, he admitted. I should be minding my own affairs, but I've seen people in trouble before, Miss Emerson. Sometimes having someone, even a stranger, stand beside you can make all the difference. For a long moment, she said nothing, and Beau was certain she would ask him to leave. Then the wariness in her eyes gave way to something like resignation. Close the door, Mr. Edwards. He did as she asked, then watched as she crossed to the section of mismatched flooring. She knelt, her skirts pooling around her, and carefully worked her fingers along the edge of one board. It lifted easily, revealing a narrow gap. She glanced up at him, hesitated, then pulled the board away completely. Other boards followed until a square opening appeared, revealing a small ladder leading down into darkness. What I'm about to show you could put you in danger, she said quietly. You can still walk away. Any sensible man would have done exactly that. Beau had survived by avoiding other people's troubles, by keeping to himself, by remembering his father's warnings that trust got men killed. I'm not walking away, he heard himself say. Willow lit a lamp and led the way down the ladder. Beau followed, ducking his head beneath the low ceiling of the space below. As the lamplight spread, he drew in a sharp breath. The room beneath the floorboards was small but carefully arranged. A narrow cot stood against one wall, covered with a patchwork quilt. A trunk sat at its foot. A small table held books and writing materials, but what caught Beau's attention was the far corner, where a second cot held a sleeping child, a girl perhaps 5 or 6 years old, with the same chestnut hair as Willow. My sister Daisy, Willow whispered, moving to the child's side. She's been ill with fever, which is why she's resting now. I bring her up when the children are gone, but when school is in session. You keep her hidden, Beau finished, trying to make sense of it. But why? Willow's hand gently brushed the hair from her sister's forehead, because Gilbert Reed would take her from me if he knew where we were. Reed. Our stepfather, the word held a wealth of bitterness. After our parents died 4 years ago, he married our mother's sister, our guardian. He's a wealthy man in St. Louis, respected. No one saw what he really was. Her voice dropped lower. No one believed me when I tried to tell them what happened behind closed doors. Understanding dawned, cold and sickening. He hurt you. Me, my aunt, and when he started looking at Daisy, she shook her head. I couldn't let that happen, so I took her and ran as far west as I could go. I changed our name. We were the Aldridge girls then. I lied about my age to get the teaching position here. For almost a year, we've been safe. And now he's found you, Beau said, the pieces falling into place. The man asking questions at the hotel. Willow nodded. It wasn't Reed himself, one of his hired men. Sheriff Conway sent him on his way with a story about never hearing our names, but she looked up at Beau, fear and determination mingling in her gaze. It's only a matter of time before Reed comes himself. Beau's mind raced. His instincts told him to walk away. This wasn't his fight. But something deeper, something he'd tried to bury beneath years of self-reliance, wouldn't let him turn his back on Willow and her sister. What will you do? What I've always done, she replied. Run, find another town, another name. And live in fear for how long? As long as necessary, until Daisy is grown, if that's what it takes. Her chin lifted defiantly. I won't let him find her. Beau looked around the cramped, hidden room, trying to imagine the courage it had taken to create this sanctuary, to stand alone against a powerful man, to protect a child at any cost. In that moment, his father's warning seemed hollow against the reality of Willow's strength. There might be another way, he said slowly, one that doesn't involve running. Willow's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? I don't know yet, he admitted, but give me the 3 days before the cattle drive. Let me help you find a solution. Why would you do that? You don't know us. It was a question Beau had been asking himself since he'd first seen that loose floorboard. The answer came to him with surprising clarity, because no one should face this kind of fight alone. And because sometimes, Miss Emerson, the frontier demands that we trust someone. The irony of those words, so contrary to everything he'd believed, wasn't lost on him. For 8 years he'd avoided attachments, convinced that survival meant isolation. Yet here he was, volunteering to help a woman he barely knew fight a battle that wasn't his. After a long moment, Willow nodded. 3 days, she agreed. But if we can't find another solution by then, Daisy and I leave. On the ladder, as they prepared to return to the schoolroom, Willow paused. Mr. Edwards, she said quietly, thank you. The simple words carried a weight of gratitude that made Beau uncomfortable. He wasn't used to being thanked, to being needed. Don't thank me yet, he said gruffly. I haven't done anything. You didn't walk away, she replied. For us, that's something. The next morning, Beau sought out Sheriff Conway before reporting to the Peterson ranch. The sheriff's office was a small, tidy building on the main street, manned by a man who looked to be in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd seen his share of frontier troubles. Conway listened silently as Beau explained what he knew, his weathered face revealing nothing. When Beau finished, the sheriff leaned back in his chair with a heavy sigh. I figured it was something like that when that fancy-dressed fella came asking about 2 sisters from St. Louis, he said, Miss Emerson's been good for this town, finest teacher we've had. Kids actually wanting to learn now. He shook his head. But if this read is as connected as you say, I'm not sure what I can do officially. Unofficially then, Beau pressed. There must be some way to stop him. Conway studied him thoughtfully. Why do you care so much, Edwards? You just rode in. Willow Emerson's troubles aren't yours. It was a question Beau had been asking himself. I'm not sure, he admitted, but I know what it's like to be alone against something bigger than yourself. The sheriff nodded slowly. Fair enough. I'll telegraph some contacts, see what I can learn about this Reed character. Meanwhile, you keep this quiet. Last thing we need is town gossip reaching the wrong ears. Beau spent the day working at the Peterson ranch, his body going through the familiar motions of ranch work while his mind turned over possible solutions to Willow's predicament. By evening he was no closer to an answer, but found himself riding back toward the schoolhouse regardless. This time Willow was expecting him. She'd closed the school for the day, citing preparations for the coming week, and had brought Daisy up from the hidden room. The little girl was pale but bright-eyed, her fever having broken overnight. Mr. Beau has promised to help us, Daisy, Willow explained as she prepared a simple supper for the 3 of them. The child regarded him solemnly from her seat at the table. Are you a knight? In my storybook, knights help ladies in trouble. Beau couldn't help but smile. No, not a knight. Just a cowboy. Cowboys can be heroes, too, Daisy declared with childlike confidence, like in Miss Willow's stories. Willow colored slightly. I may have embellished some tales of Western bravery for bedtime stories, she admitted. Over the simple meal, Beau found himself drawn into conversation with the sisters. Daisy chattered about her lessons and the books Willow read to her, while Willow spoke of her students and her hopes to expand the school eventually. Neither mentioned their past in St. Louis or Reed, as if by unspoken agreement the evening would be free of those shadows. As night fell, Beau reluctantly prepared to leave. I should get back to town, he said, rising from the table. I told Sheriff Conway what's happening. He's making inquiries about Reed. Willow walked him to the door, stepping outside with him into the cool evening air. Stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine from the distant mountains. You didn't have to get involved in this, she said quietly. Most men would have walked away. Maybe I'm not most men, Beau replied, then felt foolish at his own words. But Willow smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. No, she agreed, I don't believe you are. Something shifted between them in that moment, a connection that transcended their brief acquaintance, a recognition of something kindred. For a heartbeat, Beau was tempted to reach out, to touch her hand, to do something to acknowledge this unexpected feeling. Instead, he cleared his throat and stepped back. I'll come by tomorrow after I finish at Peterson's, he said. We'll figure something out. As he rode back to town, Beau was uncomfortably aware that in 2 days, he'd broken most of the rules he'd lived by since his father's death. He'd involved himself in someone else's troubles, he'd shared confidences with a sheriff he barely knew, and worst of all, he'd begun to care what happened to Willow and Daisy Emerson. You're a fool, Edwards, he muttered to himself. But for the first time, the prospect of riding out with the cattle drive in 2 days brought no satisfaction, only the knowledge that he'd be leaving Willow to face her battles alone. The next morning, Sheriff Conway summoned Beau to his office. The older man looked like he hadn't slept, dark circles under his eyes as he pored over telegraph forms on his desk. "Your Gilbert Reed is quite a character," Conway said without preamble. "Wealthy businessman, widower, remarried to Catherine Aldridge 4 years ago, respected member of St. Louis society." He pushed a telegram across the desk. "But there've been rumors, nothing that stuck, mind you, about his first wife's death, and 3 house servants who worked for him have disappeared over the years." Beau scanned the telegram, a cold feeling settling in his stomach. Does he have the law on his side regarding Daisy? Conway grimaced. As Catherine Aldridge Reed's husband, and with the girls having no other living relatives, courts would likely consider him their legal guardian. Unless, he hesitated. Unless what? Unless Willow were married, the sheriff said slowly. A married woman's guardian would be her husband, not her stepfather. Reed would have no claim on Willow then. And Daisy. If Willow and her husband petitioned for guardianship of her sister, given the circumstances, most judges would grant it. Conway leaned back. Of course, that would require Willow to have a husband. The implication hung in the air between them. Beau stared at the sheriff, certain he'd misunderstood. "You're suggesting." "I'm not suggesting anything," Conway said mildly. "Just explaining the law as I understand it." Beau left the sheriff's office in a daze, his thoughts in turmoil. A marriage of convenience. It was an old frontier solution to problems of inheritance, protection, or propriety. But to propose such a thing to a woman he'd known for just 2 days, yet what other option was there? In less than 48 hours, he'd be leaving with Peterson's cattle drive. Willow had made it clear that she and Daisy would flee if no other solution presented itself. And if Reed arrived while Beau was gone, there would be no one to stand between him and the sisters. The thought of Willow and Daisy being dragged back to St. Louis, to that man's care, was unbearable. By the time he reached the schoolhouse that evening, Beau had wrestled with the idea from every angle. He still had no good answer, but time was running short. If nothing else, Willow deserved to know all her options, no matter how unconventional. She greeted him at the door with obvious relief. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come," she admitted, ushering him inside where Daisy was already setting the table for supper. "Got held up with the sheriff," Beau explained. "He found out some things about Reed." After Daisy was tucked into bed in the hidden room, safely out of earshot, Beau relayed what Conway had discovered. Willow listened, her face growing increasingly pale as he described the rumors about Reed's first wife and the missing servants. "I always knew," she whispered. "Even before he turned his attention to Daisy, I knew he was capable of terrible things." She wrapped her arms around herself. "Sheriff Conway confirms what I've always feared. If Reed finds us, he won't just take Daisy, he'll make sure I can never interfere again." The bleakness in her voice strengthened Beau's resolve. "There might be a way to stop him," he said carefully. "Conway mentioned that if you were married, Reed would no longer be your guardian under the law." Willow's head came up, her eyes widening as she grasped the implication. "A marriage of convenience. It would give you legal protection," Beau continued, struggling to keep his voice matter-of-fact. "You and your husband could petition for guardianship of Daisy. Reed would have no claim on either of you." "My husband," she repeated, studying his face. "And who would that be, Mr. Edwards? Some obliging local man, one of Sheriff Conway's deputies, perhaps?" Beau met her gaze steadily. "It would have to be someone Reed couldn't easily intimidate or bribe, someone with nothing to gain and everything to lose if Reed got his way." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "You're suggesting yourself." "I am." The words seemed to hang in the air between them, changing everything. Willow rose from her chair, moving to the window to stare out at the night. "You're leaving in 2 days," she said softly. "The cattle drive." "I could stay," he replied. "Peterson would find another hand." "And then what? We barely know each other, Mr. Edwards." "Beau," he corrected. "If we're discussing marriage, you should use my given name." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Beau then, but my point stands. Why would you do this? Tie yourself to a woman you met 3 days ago, take on responsibility for a child who isn't yours, face down a dangerous man who has wealth and influence." It was a question Beau had been asking himself all day. The answer had come to him as he rode toward the schoolhouse, watching the setting sun paint the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson. Because for 8 years, I've been running from connections, he said quietly. Believing that survival meant standing alone, but watching you with Daisy, seeing what you've sacrificed to protect her, I've realized that maybe true strength comes from what we're willing to do for others. He took a step toward her, then another, until he stood beside her at the window. I'm not offering this lightly, Willow, and I'm not expecting. That is, it would be a marriage on paper only if that's what you want, but it would give you and Daisy protection under the law. It would give you a chance to stop running. Willow turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the lamplight. And what would it give you? The question caught him off guard. He hadn't thought about what he might gain, only what he could offer. A purpose, he said finally, something more than drifting from one cattle drive to the next. For a long moment she said nothing, her eyes searching his face as if looking for signs of deception or ulterior motives. Then so softly he almost missed it, yes. Yes. Yes, I'll marry you, Beau Edwards. Her voice grew stronger, for Daisy's protection and to end Reed's threat over us both. Relief and an unexpected surge of something warmer flooded through Beau. He took her hand, surprising them both with the gesture. We'll speak to Conway in the morning. He can arrange for a justice of the peace. As he rode back to town for what would be his last night in the hotel, Beau's mind spun with the magnitude of what he'd just committed to. Marriage, even one of convenience, was the last thing he'd expected when he rode into Broken Valley. Yet instead of the panic he might have anticipated, he felt a curious sense of rightness, as if a path he hadn't known existed had suddenly opened before him. Sheriff Conway received the news with poorly disguised satisfaction the next morning. I'll arrange everything, he promised. Judge Wilson can perform the ceremony this afternoon. And I'll start the paperwork for Daisy's guardianship right away. Word spread quickly through the small town. By noon, it seemed everyone in Broken Valley knew that the schoolteacher and the newly arrived Cowboy were to be married. Curious glances and whispers followed Beau as he made his way from the general store, where he'd purchased a new shirt for the occasion, to Peterson's ranch to explain his change in plans. The rancher took the news with surprising equanimity. Figured something was brewing when you kept riding back to town, he said. Can't say I'm not disappointed to lose a good hand, but a man's got to follow his heart. Before Beau could protest that his heart had nothing to do with it, Peterson added, Town's been worried about Miss Emerson being out at that schoolhouse alone. She's good for Broken Valley. You do right by her, Edwards. The ceremony itself was simple and brief. Judge Wilson, a stern-faced man with kind eyes, performed the service in the sheriff's office with Conway and the general store owner's wife as witnesses. Willow wore her best dress, a modest affair of deep green that matched her eyes, while Beau, freshly bathed and shaved, felt awkward in his new shirt and brushed coat. Daisy watched the proceedings with wide-eyed wonder, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers that Mrs. Peterson had brought from her garden. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, the little girl clapped her hands in delight, seemingly untroubled by the unconventional circumstances. There was no celebration afterward, though several townspeople stopped by the sheriff's office to offer congratulations. By unspoken agreement, the story of Reed and the threat he posed remained between Beau, Willow, and Sheriff Conway. To the rest of Broken Valley, it was simply a whirlwind romance, unusual perhaps, but not unheard of on the frontier where life moved at its own pace. As the sun began to set, Beau drove a borrowed wagon to the schoolhouse, now his home as well as Willow's. His few possessions had been loaded in the back, along with supplies from the general store and a small gift from the Petersons, a handmade quilt that Mrs. Peterson insisted was a proper wedding present. Home, Willow said softly as they pulled up to the schoolhouse. The word seemed to hang in the air between them, weighted with implications neither was ready to address. That evening was a study in careful politeness as they navigated the suddenly intimate quarters. Beau insisted on sleeping in the schoolroom, using his bedroll on the floor, while Willow and Daisy took the small bedroom attached to the building. It's not necessary, Willow protested. The floor is hard and you've already done so much. It's fine, Beau assured her. I've slept on worse. Besides, this way there's no risk of the children gossiping if one happens to arrive early and finds me here. The arrangement established, they settled into an uneasy routine. Days passed with Willow teaching while Beau found work around town, mending fences for the widow Jenkins, helping the blacksmith with a backlog of horseshoes, repairing the church roof. Evenings were spent sharing meals, with Daisy's chatter filling silences that might otherwise have grown uncomfortable. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the awkwardness between them began to ease. Beau found himself looking forward to returning to the schoolhouse each evening, to Willow's quiet smile of greeting and Daisy's enthusiastic accounts of her day. For her part, Willow seemed to relax gradually in his presence, her guard lowering as days passed without sign of Reed. One evening, as they sat on the schoolhouse steps watching the sunset while Daisy played nearby, Willow turned to him with unexpected directness. "Are you sorry," she asked, "about all this, I mean?" Beau considered the question seriously. 2 weeks ago, he'd been a drifter with no attachments, answerable to no one. Now he was a married man with responsibilities to a wife and her young sister. By any rational measure, he should be feeling trapped, anxious to move on. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging. "No," he said finally, "I'm not sorry." Her eyes searched his face, even though it's not a real marriage. The question hung between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Beau was acutely aware of her nearness, of the soft curve of her cheek in the fading light, of how easy it would be to bridge the small distance between them. "Willow," he began, uncertain what he meant to say. The moment was broken by a shout from down the road. They both turned to see Sheriff Conway approaching on horseback, riding hard. Beau rose, immediately alert. Conway wouldn't be riding out at this hour unless something was wrong. The sheriff reined in his horse before them, his face grim. "Reed's in Helena," he announced without preamble. "My contact there telegraphed this afternoon. He's asking questions, showing photographs of Willow and Daisy." Willow went pale, her hand reaching instinctively for Daisy. "How long do we have?" "Helena's 3 days' ride," Conway replied. "Maybe less if he pushes hard. I've sent word to Judge Wilson to expedite the guardianship papers, but they may not be finalized before Reed arrives." Beau's mind raced. "Even without the guardianship papers, our marriage gives Willow protection from him. He has no claim on her now." "True," Conway acknowledged. "But he could still contest your guardianship of Daisy, claim you're unfit, or that the marriage was arranged solely to circumvent his rights." The sheriff's weathered face showed his concern. "A man with Reed's money can make legal trouble, even if the law's not on his side." "Then we need to be ready when he comes," Beau said firmly. "We need to present a united front, a real family that no judge would dream of separating." Later, after Daisy was asleep and Conway had returned to town with promises to keep them informed, Beau and Willow sat at the kitchen table, planning their defense. "We need to know more about his first wife's death," Willow said. "If the rumors are true, if he was somehow responsible." "Conway's already making inquiries," Beau reminded her. "But we can't count on finding proof after all this time." Willow's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her cup of tea. "He'll be convincing," she warned. "Charming, reasonable. He'll make me sound hysterical or worse, manipulative. That's how he operates. No one ever sees the monster beneath the gentleman's facade." Beau reached across the table to cover her hand with his. "I see you, Willow. I believe you. And so does everyone in Broken Valley who matters." She looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Why do you believe me when so many others didn't?" "Because I know what it costs to protect someone you love," he said simply. "I saw what you built under those floorboards, not just a hiding place but a home. No one goes to those lengths without good reason." Impulsively, Willow turned her hand beneath his, twining their fingers together. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." That night, as Beau lay on his bedroll in the schoolroom, staring at the ceiling, he realized with startling clarity that somewhere between finding that loose floorboard and now, his feelings for Willow had become anything but convenient. The marriage might have begun as an arrangement, but his heart hadn't received the message. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a determination he hadn't felt in years. Reed might be wealthy and connected, but Beau had something worth fighting for, not just Willow and Daisy's safety, but a chance at the kind of life he convinced himself he didn't want or deserve. The next 2 days passed in tense preparation. Judge Wilson delivered the guardianship papers, signed and official, with a stern warning that Reed might still contest them. Conway arranged for a deputy to keep watch on the road from Helena, ready to ride back with warning when Reed was spotted. The townspeople, sensing something amiss though not knowing the details, closed ranks around their schoolteacher and her new husband, offering support in the form of meals delivered, repairs completed, and discreet inquiries about whether the sheriff might be needed. On the third morning, the warning came. Reed had been seen on the road to Broken Valley, accompanied by two men who looked more hired muscle than traveling companions. They were less than an hour out. Beau stood on the schoolhouse steps, watching the road, his father's old Colt revolver holstered at his hip. He'd hoped never to need it again, but some threats couldn't be answered with words alone. Willow emerged from inside, her face composed though her eyes betrayed her fear. "The children have been sent home," she said. "Sheriff Conway is on his way." "Good," Beau nodded. "When Reed arrives, let me do the talking at first. He'll be expecting you, not me." She touched his arm, the gesture natural now after weeks of gradually increasing comfort between them. "Be careful, he's dangerous, Beau, more than you know." He covered her hand with his own. "So am I when protecting what matters." They heard the riders before they saw them, 3 horses approaching at a steady pace. Then they appeared around the bend in the road, a well-dressed man on a fine bay horse, flanked by 2 rougher-looking individuals whose eyes scanned their surroundings with professional wariness. Gilbert Reed was not what Beau had expected. Instead of the obvious villain of his imagination, Reed was a handsome, distinguished-looking man in his 40s, with silver threading his dark hair and an air of cultured authority. As the 3 riders approached the schoolhouse, Reed's gaze passed over Beau with dismissive indifference before fixing on Willow. "Wilhelmina," he called, using a name Beau had never heard. "This has been quite the chase, my dear. Your aunt has been beside herself with worry." Willow's hand tightened on Beau's arm, but her voice was steady when she replied, "My name is Willow Emerson Edwards now, and Catherine knows exactly why I took Daisy away." Reed's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "A charming fabrication, but one easily disproved. I've come to take you and Margaret home where you belong." "The only home my wife and her sister have is here," Beau said, stepping forward. "And their names are Willow and Daisy Edwards." Now Reed's attention shifted fully to Beau, his gaze assessing. "And you are?" "Beau Edwards, Willow's husband." A thin smile curved Reed's lips. How convenient. "And recent, I imagine." He dismounted with fluid grace, handing his reins to one of his companions. "I admire your resourcefulness, Wilhelmina, but this charade won't stand. The courts will recognize my rights as your guardian." "The courts recognize me as her husband," Beau countered, "and both of us as Daisy's legal guardians. Judge Wilson signed the papers himself. Sheriff Conway has copies." For the first time, Reed's composure slipped slightly. "A frontier judge and sheriff," he scoffed. "Against my attorneys in St. Louis. Don't be naive, young man." "This isn't St. Louis," came Conway's voice as the sheriff approached on foot, having left his horse hitched in town. "And out here, we take a dim view of men who chase young women across the country, especially when those women have gone to such lengths to escape them." Reed turned to face the newcomer, his expression hardening. "Sheriff, I presume I'm simply attempting to retrieve my wards, my stepdaughter and her sister, who ran away after developing some unfortunate delusions about my character." "Delusions?" Willow's voice rang out, stronger than Beau had ever heard it. "Is that what you call what you did to Catherine, what you tried to do to Daisy, what happened to your first wife, Gilbert, or those servants who disappeared?" A dangerous stillness came over Reed. "You should be careful with such accusations, Wilhelmina. They border on slander." "It's only slander if it's not true," Conway said mildly. "And I've received some interesting telegrams about you, Mr. Reed, seems St. Louis has its share of secrets, and not all of them are as well kept as you might hope." Reed's companions shifted uneasily, hands drifting toward their gun belts, but Reed himself remained coldly composed. "Whatever tales you've heard, they're meaningless without proof, and I assure you there is none." "There's me," came a small voice from the schoolhouse doorway. Daisy stood there, her little face set in lines of determination that mirrored her sister's. "I remember what you did." Willow moved quickly to her sister's side, drawing her protectively close. "Daisy, go back inside." But the child stood firm. "He hurt Aunt Catherine," she said clearly, "and he came into my room at night. That's why Willow took me away." Reed's face twisted with a flash of genuine rage before he mastered himself. "The imaginings of a confused child," he said dismissively. Hardly evidence. It's enough for me, Conway said, his hand resting near his own sidearm. Mr. Reed, I suggest you return to Helena. The Edwards family isn't going anywhere with you. For a tense moment, it seemed Reed might order his men to force the issue. Beau shifted subtly, positioning himself between Reed and the sisters, his hand ready to draw if needed. But Reed was too calculating for such a direct confrontation. His eyes moved from Conway to Beau to Willow, cold assessment in every glance. This isn't over, he said finally. A hasty marriage and frontier justice won't protect you forever, Wilhelmina. I'll be back with proper authorities and legal documents that even your sheriff friend can't ignore. You do that, Conway replied evenly. And I'll have my own documents ready, statements about those missing servants, inquiries into your first wife's convenient accident, testimonies from others who have seen your true nature. Frontier justice works both ways, Mr. Reed. Sometimes it means a man can't hide behind his money and connections. Something in Conway's tone must have convinced Reed that the threat was genuine. With a final cold look at Willow, he remounted his horse. We'll meet again, he promised, then wheeled his mount and rode away, his men following close behind. They watched until the three riders disappeared around the bend, the tension slowly ebbing from the air. Conway let out a long breath. He'll be back, the sheriff warned. Men like that don't give up easily. But not right away, Beau said. He'll want to check what evidence you might have, prepare his legal approach. That gives us time, Willow said, still holding Daisy close. Time to gather our own evidence, strengthen our position. Conway nodded. I'll keep digging. There are people in St. Louis who might talk now that questions are being asked openly. He tipped his hat to them. You folks try to get some rest. Been a tense few days. After the sheriff left, the three of them stood in silence for a moment, the reality of what had just occurred settling around them. Then Daisy looked up at Beau with complete trust. You didn't let the bad man take us, she said simply. No, Beau agreed, kneeling to her level, and I never will. The little girl nodded solemnly, as if this confirmed something she'd already known, then slipped from her sister's grasp to wrap her arms around Beau's neck in a fierce hug. The simple gesture of trust broke something open inside him, some last defense against the vulnerability of caring too deeply. Over Daisy's head, his eyes met Willow's. What he saw there, gratitude, relief, and something warmer that matched the feeling unfurling in his own chest, told him everything he needed to know. That evening, after Daisy was asleep, Beau found Willow sitting on the schoolhouse steps, gazing at the stars. He sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. He'll come back, she said softly. Reed doesn't give up what he considers his. When he does, we'll be ready, Beau promised, and we won't be alone. This whole town stands with you, Willow. She turned to look at him, her face silvered by moonlight. With us, she corrected gently. They stand with us now. The distinction wasn't lost on him. Yes, he agreed. With us. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant call of a nighthawk and the soft whisper of the breeze through the pines. Finally, Willow spoke again, her voice hesitant. Beau, when this is over, when Reed is truly gone, what then? He knew what she was asking. Their marriage had been one of convenience, a shield against a specific threat. When that threat was removed, what would remain? When I rode into Broken Valley, he said slowly, I believed that surviving the frontier meant keeping to myself, trusting no one, forming no attachments. My father died believing that. And for 8 years I lived by his warning. He turned to face her fully. But I was wrong, these past weeks with you and Daisy. I've been more alive than I can remember being since I was a boy. Even with the danger, the uncertainty. Especially then, he admitted, because for the first time, I was fighting for something that mattered more than just survival. Willow's eyes searched his face. What are you saying, Beau? I'm saying that when this is over, I don't want our marriage to be just on paper anymore. The words came more easily than he'd expected, as if they'd been waiting for this moment. I'm saying I love you, Willow, and if you'll have me, I want to be a real husband to you and a father to Daisy. For one heart-stopping moment, she said nothing, and Beau feared he'd misread everything. Then Willow reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his cheek. I think I've been falling in love with you since you refused to walk away when you found our hiding place, she whispered. But I was afraid to hope. Beau covered her hand with his own, turning his face to press a kiss against her palm. "Hope is all I've got to offer," he said. "That, and a promise to stand beside you no matter what comes." "It's enough," she assured him, leaning forward until their foreheads touched. "It's everything." When their lips met, it felt like coming home, not to a place, but to a truth Beau had been running from his entire adult life. The frontier wasn't meant to be faced alone. Strength wasn't found in isolation, but in what we're willing to risk for those we love. The battle with Reed wasn't over. There would be legal challenges, perhaps even more direct threats. But as Beau held Willow under the vast Montana sky, he knew with absolute certainty that whatever came, they would face it together. And in that certainty was a peace he'd never known before. 1 month later, Sheriff Conway received a telegram from St. Louis that changed everything. Reed's first wife's brother had come forward with evidence that his sister's accident had been anything but. 2 former servants had also emerged from hiding with testimonies about Reed's cruelty. And most damning of all, Catherine Aldridge Reed herself had finally found the courage to speak about the abuse she had suffered at her husband's hands. Gilbert Reed was arrested in St. Louis before he could mount another attempt to claim Willow and Daisy. The legal proceedings would be lengthy, but Conway assured them that Reed would never threaten them again. That evening, as they shared the news with Daisy over supper in what was now truly their home, Beau watched the burden of fear finally lift from Willow's shoulders. She laughed more freely than he'd ever heard, and the sight filled him with a joy he'd never thought possible. Later, as they stood together on the schoolhouse porch watching Daisy chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Willow leaned against Beau's side. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out if you hadn't noticed that loose floorboard?" she asked. Beau slipped his arm around her waist, drawing her closer. "I try not to," he admitted, "but I'm grateful every day that I did." "So am I," she said, turning in his embrace to face him. "My night in dusty chaps." He laughed at that, then sobered as he looked into her eyes. "I rode into Broken Valley believing the frontier was no place for love," he said quietly. "You proved me wrong. You and Daisy showed me that even here, especially here, love isn't just possible, it's necessary." Willow rose on tiptoe to kiss him, a kiss full of promise and belonging. As Daisy's delighted laughter echoed across the yard and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Beau Edwards knew he'd found what he'd been searching for without realizing it, not just a place to call home, but people to share it with. Not just survival, but a life worth living. And it had all begun with a loose floorboard and the courage of a young woman determined to protect what she loved most.